Okay, the scripture reading today is taken from the 11th chapter of Exodus. This happened after God had put the first 9 plagues on the Egyptians, but Pharaoh still would not let the Israelites go. Now the Lord said to Moses, "One more plague I will bring on Pharaoh and on Egypt. After that he will let you go from here. When he lets you go, he will surely drive you out from here completely. Speak now in the hearing of the people, that each man ask from his neighbor and each woman from his neighbor for articles of silver and articles of gold." The king gave the people favor in this correction. The Lord gave the people favor in the sight of the Egyptians. Furthermore, the man Moses himself was greatly esteemed in the land of Egypt, both in the sight of Pharaoh's servants and in the sight of his people. Moses said, "Thus says the Lord, about midnight I am going out into the midst of Egypt, and all the firstborn of the land of Egypt shall die, from the firstborn of the Pharaoh who sits on the throne, even to the firstborn of the slave girl who is behind the millstone, all the firstborn of the cattle as well. Moreover, there shall be a great cry in the land of Egypt, such as there has not been for before, and such as shall never be again. But against any of the sons of Israel, a dog will not even bark, whether against man or beast, that you may understand how the Lord makes a distinction between Egypt and Israel. All these your servants will come down to me and bow themselves before me, saying, Go out, you and all your people who follow you, and after that I will go out." And he went out from Pharaoh in hot anger. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Pharaoh will not listen to you, so that when my wonders will be multiplied in the land of Egypt." Moses and Aaron performed all these wonders before Pharaoh, yet the Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart, and he did not let the sons of Israel go out of his land.
So I was reading a sports writer who was talking about his assessment of spring training for baseball, and things that he's gathered as he's watched it. And one of his comments was, one of his surprises here early in the season on the spring training was it turned out that those batting gloves really didn't need to be adjusted after all. What he was talking about was one of the changes that's coming here in Major League Baseball is a pitching clock. And so they put them on, they're trying to shorten these games. And so they, every time like you get done with the pitch, they start running this clock, and they've got all these different rules about how many seconds you have until the batter has to be in the batter's box, ready to receive a pitch. And they've got so many seconds till the pitcher has to deliver it. So there's this like pace of game stuff that's going on. And what it's doing is it's taking all these, certainly it's changing the way the pitchers are pitching, but it's also changing all of these lifetime of rhythms and patterns for all these hitters. You know, like they want to sit around and like scratch themselves and adjust every piece of their clothing and do all this stuff for like an hour, and then like step into the plate, you know, kind of practice swinging a little bit, and, you know, like recreate like this swing every single time. So like, you know, the games wind up being 4 hours long from all that. So they're trying to eliminate all that, but of course it's making them change this practice, these habits that they formed. And what it reminded me as I'm thinking about that is, you know, there's an old phrase, there's versions of it, but it's something like, you know, when under pressure, you don't rise to the occasion. You sink to the level of your training. I mean, there's versions of that phrase that have been around for literally like 2,500 years. But the basic idea is that you establish a baseline, and it's true for, you know, athletes having these rhythms and practices and routines that they get into. It's true of like an ER doctor that's having that moment where they see something unfamiliar, so they work the system, work their training to come up with these rhythms of how they're going to understand. And I think it's useful for us to think about as Christians, what is the baseline? What is that thing that we fall back on when the times get hard, when the crisis comes? And I think that's what Exodus 11 gives us a moment to pause and think about. This is a transitional moment. Exodus 11, as Jack said, this is at the end of the 9 plagues, getting ready for the 10th. And this is a moment, it's a short chapter. We just read the whole thing. And it's there to give us pause. It's one of those kind of flyover moments where you're kind of getting the big picture. What is going on? What is this thing really about? But as we look at it, and it both really is as a way of summarizing where we've been, and also to anticipate where we're getting ready to head. What I want us to do is to look at this lens through really 3 different actors that really drive the story of Exodus 11, and how we see each of them responding differently to the work of God, and what it says about them, and ultimately what it says about us. So if you don't have your Bibles open, I encourage you to open them to Exodus 11. And as we start there, the first one, the big character that I want us to think about is Pharaoh. This is really, the kind of the ending of a big, long journey with him. We're going to see a little bit more of him. Some key moments are coming. But this has been an intense focus on Pharaoh week after week as we've moved through these 9 plagues. And in fact, the big idea that we think about Pharaoh, what is Pharaoh here in Exodus 11? Well, Pharaoh's a tool. Pharaoh is a tool in God's sovereign hand. And you see that in the way the chapter is framed. You've got that word, plague, there. Verse 1. The Lord said to Moses, "Yet one plague more I will bring upon you." I think that's the first time that the word plague is actually used in the book of Exodus, or to describe these plagues. This is the summary. This is kind of the picture to say, what has this all been about? He's going to strike them. He's going to bring this down upon them. And it is a culmination of this long journey. And the way he ends chapter 11, so it's framing the story. What he says, the Lord said to Moses, verse 9, "Pharaoh will not listen to you, that my wonders may be multiplied in the land of Egypt." That is to say, God is giving this. God has given all of these plagues. He's been sending all of this. It's not only that God is the one that's the power behind all of these things that are happening, but it's God who has determined the timetable. And he has prolonged this. He has prolonged Israel's suffering, which is one of the prices of the plagues. That he's letting this suffering go on longer than it might otherwise, because he wants the people to see, he wants others to see that his wonders may be multiplied. We will see God differently because he chooses the timetable, because he slows this down. And so he's a tool. Pharaoh is caught up in a game that's really beyond his control, as much as you see him exercising his own, quote, sovereignty. But that sovereignty that Pharaoh's been exercising, I'm in charge, I control these people, I'm controlling my land, is something that has been judged time and time again. And as we sit here in chapter 11, kind of summarizing and preparing for what is to come, you see the second idea that God delivers Israel by delivering a judgment on Pharaoh and his sovereignty. You see really 2 things that are happening here. And it's themes that we've seen. This is a way of summary. It's the same thing that's been happening throughout the plagues. There's first, it's a judgment on everything that he rules over. It is a judgment on the land and on the people. And so there is this language, this repetition as he begins to strike down the firstborn. That's the promise that's coming. I'm going to strike down. What firstborn am I going to strike down? Well, verse 5. Every firstborn in the land of Egypt, from the firstborn of Pharaoh, who sits on the throne, even to the firstborn of the slave girl who's behind the handmill, and to the firstborn of the cattle. For the people, you see from top to bottom, that phrase is kind of a quirky little phrase to describe the slave girl who's behind the handmill. But I think we can get the gist that it's Pharaoh's own son, down to the bottom, the poorest of the poor. Everyone will be impacted. In fact, I think, some of your translations will say something like every firstborn son. It can be a little bit misleading, because I think the way that language works, it would suggest that if they don't have any sons, if it's just have daughters, firstborn daughter is going to go too. Every single family will be impacted by this. This is a comprehensive judgment on every person that Pharaoh rules over. That's his land. It is now subject to this judgment. And so it's a judgment on the land and the people. It is also a judgment on the gods. I think you see that in a couple of different ways. I think you see that in this very strange thing that it spells out. It's going to be the firstborn of the cattle. And if the cattle get into it, what do they have to do with any of this? Well, we've seen before, these folks worship a lot of things, but one of the things they really like to worship is they worship cows. It's like ancient, it's like a Hinduism, kind of modern Hinduism revisited in the ancient world. They had a high view of cattle. So they've even got some of their gods where they literally have a bull in their temple that's supposed to be the incarnation of that god. So as he's striking down the cattle, that is, well, I think it is also a strike at their livelihood, it's a strike at something they see precious, but it is a strike at their divinity, or that which they worship. I think also, even just beyond the cattle, even striking down and killing the firstborn, the death itself is an attack on their gods. There is no culture in the ancient world that spent more money per capita on the afterlife than the Egyptians. I mean, we see it today. What do you think of when you think of the Egyptians? You think of the pyramids, you think of the Sphinx, you think of like King Tut, mummies. What is all that about? It's all about the afterlife. The enormous amount of money that they as a culture would spend on the afterlife, preparing for the afterlife, thinking about the afterlife, knowing that the afterlife is coming. And here he is as he strikes them down. He's striking down the gods that they worship. He's telling them they've misunderstood what this whole thing is about. He is delivering a judgment on Pharaoh's sovereignty, on the gods that Pharaoh represents. He is the embodiment of these gods. He is the one that they worship as the incarnation of God. So even striking down his firstborn is to say they're striking down the Son of God. Does it sound familiar to you? There's a judgment that he is delivering on Pharaoh and his land. And he delivers them, the third idea is that he delivered through this thing that we've seen throughout, by hardening Pharaoh's heart. And as we come to the end, you notice we began all the way back before the plagues. God said, he's not going to let you go, I'm going to harden his heart. And then along the way, we sometimes we would talk about, Pharaoh hardens his own heart. So Pharaoh's morally responsible for this. Whatever's happening, if we're there at the scene watching this unfold, Pharaoh's doing what he wants to do. But the deep truth that frames the story, begins with it, ends with it, is that God hardens Pharaoh's heart. He says it here at the end. He hardens his heart. So what's going on there? Why is God hardening his heart? I want to suggest a couple of things to you to help us think about. That Pharaoh represents, in some ways he is the embodiment scripturally of absolute evil. He is the serpent. And so when he is this serpent figure, he takes us all the way back to the Garden of Eden. He's a dragon. And when he's a dragon, then it takes us all the way to the book of Revelation. And these are the symbols that embody evil itself. He is a picture of absolute evil. And so he is also a picture as one who is an object of divine wrath. A couple of verses from the New Testament that can help us. Romans 1 will talk about how God will give people over to their sin. It's a kind of hardening that he describes when people are locked up in particular sins. And even relevant for our culture today, one of the things he talks about is homosexual sin. He talks about sexual sin and said God gives them over to that. That's a kind of hardening that's happening. He just says, he says yes to their rebellion. And one of the hardest things to see about the nature of sin, one of the most dangerous things that God could ever say to us is he could say, I agree. I'm going to let you do what you want to do. So that's Romans 1, but especially for Pharaoh, Romans 9 is one of those moments in Scripture that talks about Pharaoh and talks about the hardening of Pharaoh's heart. And so the way the New Testament, where Paul describes Pharaoh, he describes a lot of what we've just been saying, quotes this story of Pharaoh, and God pardoning, and God giving mercy on him. And this is his summary. He says, what if God, this is verse 22 of Romans 9, desiring to show his wrath and to make known his power, has endured with much patience vessels of wrath prepared for destruction, in order to make known the riches of his glory for vessels of mercy, which he has prepared beforehand for glory. It goes on from there. Romans 9 is one of the tougher chapters in the New Testament. But Paul uses the story of Pharaoh, talks about the hardening of Pharaoh's heart, and reminds them God purposed this. God has raised up Pharaoh to be this object of divine wrath. That what is happening is God's purpose unfolding. That purpose in showing wrath isn't just so God can kind of take out his frustrations. It's to show his mercy to others. When they look at Pharaoh and they see his story, there is an immense warning, and they are encouraged to change. Which is where you get to the second group that I want you to think about, which is Egypt and the Egyptians. You think about the Egyptians show up here more in the chapter, really more than Pharaoh and Israel, which the next group we'll talk about. But what does it say? And chapter 11 intrigues me because you have really two things that are said about the Egyptians that I think at first glance may seem to contradict each other. The first thing he says is really that the Egyptians are a kind of mission field. Notice what he says about it. He says, speak now, verse 2, in the hearing of the people. So what's happening is unfolding in front of the people that they ask every man of his neighbor, every woman of her neighbor, for silver and gold jewelry. And the Lord gave the people favor in the sight of the Egyptians. Moreover, the man Moses was very great in the land of Egypt, in the sight of Pharaoh's servants, and in the sight of his people. So God calls Moses to really, he gives Moses a hearing before the people, that all that's been unfolding, there is a difference between Pharaoh and the Egyptians. We saw that last week, that Pharaoh says, I'm not going to let you go. And as soon as Moses leaves the room, his advisors are like, are you crazy? Let this man go. Get him out of here. The Egyptians are hearing Moses. Many of them are he's finding favor. They see Moses as great. They recognize his power. Where Pharaoh is blind to all that Moses can do, the Egyptians are hearing him, and they're responding. And there's this description here that they're going and asking for their golden jewelry, and they're giving it to them. They want the Israelites gone, and they are happy to take all of their precious metals and give it to them. This is a picture of what God described back in Exodus chapter 3 as the plundering of Egypt. When we think about the word plunder, it's almost like a pirate image to me, like taking their treasure, conquering it. And it really is more of a military kind of imagery, that they're conquering the nation, comes in and plunders the people. Well, this is a conquest. Israel is conquering Egypt here. They talk about it in Exodus 3, they'll talk about it again next chapter. But the way it unfolds is not that Israel comes in and strong arms the Egyptians to take all their stuff. It's that they find favor with Egypt. And Egypt offers up their stuff as a free will offering, which is a fascinating picture. Egypt, many of them respond favorably to Israel. They see Yahweh's power. They see the favor that he gives to them. And some of them will leave with them. There will be this great nation. So what's happening as the Exodus unfolds is an anticipation, really laying the groundwork for the great mission vision of the Old Testament, leading us to the New Testament and the Pentecost. That you see all of these echoes where the reason why Israel exists, the reason why God delivers Israel, isn't just so that they can have a cool deliverance story. He saves them so they can be a light to the nations, as Isaiah would say. To show them, this is who God is. You need to follow God. And some respond. So there's this beautiful picture of mission here. But now consider the other side of it, which is when this 10th plague comes, who's going to die? Every firstborn in the land of Egypt. And as we've talked about the last few plagues, as these plagues have now come, as they turn deadly, these deadly plagues have been cast down upon Egypt. So these citizens who find, like Moses, they see him as great, they've been favored to the Israelites, are themselves caught up in something and are being judged. Their families, they're experiencing death in their families. And I think that's one of the big questions people ask, is this judgment fair? What do you think about when these folks seem to be responsive and yet they're going to experience the death of their firstborn? I think this idea is this, that the Egyptians are also part of an evil empire, and they suffer the consequences for being part of it. There's a lot of things you can say about the judgment. Is the judgment fair? Well, yeah, but in what ways is it fair? Well, you could say several things. One, you could say that many of these Egyptians are actually part of the work of evil that had been happening against Israel. Pharaoh can issue his commands, but he really didn't. It seems like as we read the story, he really doesn't leave his throne room much unless he goes down to the river to bathe. He's not the one enforcing all these orders. The 400 years of slavery that Israel has been enforced by somebody. And many of these folks have been part of this work that is being judged by God. And you can talk about the favor that they expressed. They kind of liked the Israelites, and they thought Moses was a pretty cool guy, but none of them had joined Israel yet. And as these plagues unfolded, there was this distinction. Egypt was dark, Israel was light. Egypt had all these nasty storms, Israel didn't. There's been a warning. If you want to be on the safe side, I want to go with Israel. And that none of them had come over yet. And so this protection that will come to Israel, and their unwillingness to be part of it, they may be favorable to it, but ultimately when the judgment comes in Exodus, this is true beyond Exodus, of course, when the judgment comes, there is a dividing line. And there is no third way. You're either on the side of divine protection or you are not. And if you're not on the side of protection, when the judgment finally comes, it doesn't matter if you say, well, I kind of like the folks that are on the protected side, and maybe someday I'll do it. There came a time, and that time passed. Exodus frames for us a picture of the judgment of God and a reminder that there's a time, and you've got to respond. And I think that's really two other responses I would have as you think about the judgment, the fairness of this judgment, which is, third, evil happens in the world. And innocent people get caught up in it. The innocent get caught. I mean, any version of this, it's the firstborns that are dying. It's not the ones that enslaved Israel. It's their kids that are dying. The innocent get caught in it. What do you do when innocent people die? Well, look how Jesus responded to it. Look at Luke 13 in the Tower of Siloam. People were asking Jesus about, hey, this tower fell. 18 people died. Were they, more evil than the rest of us? Is that why it fell on them? Is that why they died in that accident? And Jesus does not give them that answer. He doesn't say, well, yeah, those were particularly bad people. No, he says, repent or perish. Take that as a warning. There's an uncertainty. You don't know when your end comes. There's a time to decide. That time is now. Jesus uses the slings and arrows of life to preach a kind of urgency, to take seriously. You've got to decide which side of this thing are you on. And the Egyptians, even as favorable as they might be to Israel, they can't straddle a fence because you cannot straddle that fence. You're on one side or you're on the other. And so, I think behind that, I think we just have to remember that this judgment that God is giving them is the baseline that everybody deserves. And that's why I've been kind of putting the terms innocent in scare quotes, because there's nobody innocent. Romans 3:23, all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. We don't have innocence. Our baseline is that we're people worthy of judgment. What does he do? How can he lift some beyond that baseline of judgment? And I think that's where we turn to the story of Israel. That's the third group that I want us to think about. Because you don't have a lot about Israel in this chapter, but what you do have is significant. One of the things you see here is that God, as he has done throughout these plagues, God graciously guards his firstborn. And that's the distinction thing. And he says, look, this is all coming on you. There's this great cry of grief throughout Egypt in verse 6, such as has never been nor ever will be again, but not a dog will growl against any of the people of Israel, either man or beast, that you may know that the Lord makes a distinction between Egypt and Israel. God has protected Israel. And what comes from this, what's going to the next chapter, is the Passover. And in Passover, it's a key moment because it's the first time that Israel really has to do anything in the plagues. So this distinction comes before anything they've done. What has Israel done to deserve this? Absolutely nothing. All they've done is just been his people. God has called them and then he will take them on a journey and equip them. They don't earn anything. Their job throughout these 9 plagues has been to watch and learn. This is an act of grace that he has protected his firstborn. This is what he called Israel. So as he brings judgment on their firstborn, he protects his own. He's going to deliver his firstborn. And it is all through an act of unmerited faith, an act of grace. This grace, second idea, God's grace is the foundation for relationship. Exodus is one of those great spaces in the Old Testament where you can begin to build some understanding of this whole biblical doctrine of election. What is it all about? How does God choose a people? Well, one of the things you see here in this passage and throughout the plagues is that God chooses a people and then he forms a people. Then he shows up and says, yeah, that's mine. And now I'm going to make them into the kind of people I want them to be. They've been in a place where they haven't really bought into this. They're not sure. They don't think Moses can do it. And they just sit back and watch as God unfolds this deliverance. And then he's going to take them on this act of Passover, where it's just going to begin forming their identity as a people. He's going to take them out in the desert. He's going to give them the law. There's all these things that he's going to do to shape them. It's not that they are passive in response to the choosing that God gives. God chooses them. It's not that they're passive. It's that their activity is a response to God's activity. In this sense, the salvation of Israel here in Exodus parallels the hardening of Pharaoh's heart. God hardens Pharaoh, so Pharaoh prolongs his resistance. God is going to soften Israel to make them responsive. Which I think is actually, if you start tracing the theme from Exodus on through the prophets, what happens is they ultimately fail to be changed and redeemed as his people. They ultimately are going to resist. Eventually, the prophets are going to say, yeah, because the problem is not with their activity. The problem is with their heart. But guess what? I'm going to give them a new heart. I'm going to take out the heart of stone. I'm going to put in a heart of flesh. God is going to change who they are. But here in Exodus, you see that God's sovereign work is the basis for human action on both sides of the coin, whether it's those who are resisting or those who are yielding. One of those deep truths, again, in Romans 9, verse 6 says that not all who descend from Israel are Israel. God's going to take this people, and he's going to rescue them, he's going to deliver them. And when they cross over the Red Sea, there's going to be a great multitude. And it's not just multitude of national Israel. There's going to be a multitude from the nations crossing over as well. But who's really part of Israel? It's those who persevere in faith. Those who follow him. And that's a picture that I think Exodus is laying a groundwork for us that we're going to see unfold much more deeply in the New Testament. That election, that God's elect includes a remnant of Israel, includes a remnant from the nations, that every nation, tribe, and tongue will be part of God's people. But what will define God's people throughout is that they are chosen in grace, and they are chosen in grace to be changed. They are chosen in grace to be shaped, that we respond in faith, that faith is something that stays with us, that sanctifies us, and changes us. We have the Spirit of God dwelling in us, molding us, and shaping us. Israel is created here by the grace of God, and that grace is the foundation for this relationship. And so that's our baseline. That's the baseline I want for us, that we can establish our baseline in God's grace. Throughout this section, up through these first 9 plagues, Israel's job, it's going to change next week, but Israel's task has been to watch and to learn. And I don't think that's any different than our own task. That our job, I think, throughout this has been to watch and to learn, to see who God is, to see what God is like, to see how God gives grace freely to those who do not earn it, so that we never cultivate an identity as the church to say that we're somehow just the smart ones, are the ones that just figured things out where others didn't. There's never a superiority complex that should take hold of the church, because we are who we are as the people of God because of his grace for us, because of his gracious love. That grace is unearned and it is freely given, but it is not cheap. As we start the journey next week in chapter 12, we start to see how Israel is going to be called upon to look different, to act different, to live differently because of that grace. But that is, grace is the baseline. So trust in it, depend on it, build your life on it. Let's pray. God, I thank you for your grace. I thank you that we are your people, not because we've merited anything, but because of what you have done for us. And I pray that that beauty of your grace will shape us. I pray it will shape those who hear it who have not responded in faith, that it will humble them and send them to their need, that they can surrender to the beauty and power of the gospel. But for each of us, God, I pray it will humble us as well, that we can again come before the gospel to be shaped and transformed, that we might live lives of faithfulness to you and to your purpose because of your grace shown to us. In Jesus' name. If we can help in any way, please come and stand and sing.